Have you ever wondered if history itself might be hiding a secret? Not just a forgotten battle or a lost king, but something much larger, something that challenges the very way we measure time. For most people, history feels like a single continuous line. We imagine the past as a chain of events, one century flowing into the next, guiding us steadily toward the present day. But what if that line is not as secure as we believe? What if there is a gap, a stretch of time that never truly happened? This is the foundation of one of the strangest and most unsettling theories ever suggested, the phantom time hypothesis. According to this idea, nearly 300 years of history between the years 614 and 911 were fabricated. They never happened at all. They were added to the record by powerful rulers who wanted to reshape the past for their own purposes. If this sounds unbelievable, that is because it challenges everything we take for granted. Yet, when we look closely at the evidence, strange questions begin to appear. Questions that mainstream history struggles to answer with complete certainty. Why are there so few records, buildings, or artifacts from those missing centuries? Why do certain medieval documents look suspiciously similar to ones written long before? And why did a Holy Roman Emperor and a Pope seem to benefit so much from being alive in the symbolic year 1000, a year that might not have truly existed? If the theory is true, then we are not living in the year 2025. We are in the year 1725. 3 entire centuries of human history would vanish in an instant, leaving us with a timeline built on illusion. To begin understanding this mystery, we must first consider the period often referred to as the Dark Ages. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, Europe entered a time that many historians describe as decline. Literacy faded, art and culture weakened, and the progress of civilization seemed to slow down. At least, this is what we are taught. When we focus on the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, something feels unusual. There are far fewer surviving documents than we might expect. Coins and inscriptions appear rarely. Large buildings are scarce. It is almost as if an entire age left behind almost nothing at all. Later centuries of the Middle Ages gave us cathedrals, castles, and thriving towns, but the centuries before them look strangely empty. It is as though Europe itself fell into silence and then suddenly awoke again. Most historians explain this silence as a natural result of chaos, war, famine, and decline. They believe progress slowed but did not vanish. To others, however, the silence is too complete to ignore. Instead of decline, they see a missing piece of time. That missing piece is where the phantom time hypothesis begins. The idea first appeared in the 1990s through the work of a German historian named Heribert Illig. He argued that our calendar, the very system we use to measure the years, had been deliberately altered. According to Illig, medieval rulers, especially Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II, added centuries to the timeline in order to place themselves at the grand symbolic year 1000. But why would they do such a thing? Illig believed the answer was power. By adjusting the calendar, these rulers could rewrite their own legitimacy. They could place themselves at the start of a new millennium, presenting themselves as leaders chosen for a special moment in history. If this was true, hundreds of years were manufactured. Documents were edited. Chronicles were rewritten. Entire rulers, such as Charlemagne, might have been no more than inventions. Characters created to fill the empty space. At first, many scholars dismissed these claims as fantasy. Yet Illig was not entirely alone. Other researchers noticed that the evidence from those centuries is thin compared to earlier and later times. The gaps are difficult to explain away completely, and that is what keeps the theory alive. It raises an important question. How do we know history is true? We trust it through documents, through architecture, through artifacts dug from the ground. But when those pieces are missing, or when they do not quite fit together, how certain can we be? In Rome, the ruins tell a clear story. Stone upon stone, each layer marks the life of the empire. But in Europe between 600 and 900, the trail feels faint. A church here, a manuscript there, but little to show for 3 full centuries. There is also the strange issue of the calendar itself. The modern Gregorian calendar, introduced in 1582, corrected the older Julian calendar, but the correction required is smaller than what it should have been if all those centuries had truly passed. The numbers do not quite match Dr. Illig and his supporters. These gaps are not simple coincidence. They are signs of something deliberate. They point to a rewriting of time. As we move deeper into this story, we will follow the clues. We will see how rulers and priests may have shaped the timeline. We will look at coins, documents, and calendars that appear to tell a different story. And at the end, you will be left with a choice. Were the Dark Ages real? Or are we living in a phantom age, built on centuries that never existed? The phantom time hypothesis did not appear in ancient times. It was not whispered by monks in candlelit halls, or secretly passed down through generations. Instead, it emerged in the modern age, proposed by a man who looked at history with suspicion and saw something that others had ignored. His name was Heribert Illig, a German historian born in 1947, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Illig was deeply involved in historical research and publishing. He became fascinated by the inconsistencies of early medieval Europe and began to question whether the accepted timeline could be trusted. Illig was not a mainstream figure at the start. He belonged to circles of alternative history, where scholars and writers often challenged traditional views. But his idea was different. It was not just a new interpretation of events. It was a claim that the events themselves had never taken place. His theory was bold, and it quickly attracted attention, both from those who were intrigued and from those who were outraged. According to Illig, the years between 614 and 911 did not happen. They were invented, added into the calendar, and written into history books centuries after the fact. This meant that nearly 300 years of supposed European history were false. If Illig was correct, then entire generations of people, including the legendary ruler Charlemagne, never existed at all. To understand why Illig reached this conclusion, we must look at the details that first raised his suspicions. One of his central arguments was based on the calendar. The Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, was slightly inaccurate. It miscalculated the length of the solar year by about 11 minutes. That small error added up over time, creating a drift of about 1 full day every 128 years. By the 16th century, when Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582, the Julian calendar should have been off by about 13 days. Yet the correction made by Gregory was only 10 days. This suggested to Illig that 3 centuries had never passed, and that the calendar had been artificially stretched. Illig also pointed to the lack of evidence from the so-called Dark Ages. He noted that archaeological finds from the 7th to 9th centuries were extremely limited compared to other periods. Where were the coins, the inscriptions, the documents, and the buildings that should have filled those centuries? Why did so many records from that era look suspiciously like copies or repetitions of earlier works? One example that caught his attention was the figure of Charlemagne, also known as Charles the Great. Charlemagne is celebrated as the founder of modern Europe, the king who united much of the continent and revived learning in what is called the Carolingian Renaissance. His empire stretched across modern France, Germany, and Italy, and his influence was said to be enormous. Yet Illig argued that the evidence for Charlemagne's existence was strangely weak. Many of the documents describing his life were written long after his supposed reign. The statues and portraits of him looked more symbolic than realistic. To Illig, Charlemagne was not a man of flesh and blood, but a literary creation, a myth invented to give legitimacy to later rulers. At the heart of Illig's theory was the claim that this rewriting of history was deliberate. He believed that it was orchestrated by three powerful men: Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. According to Illig, Otto III wanted to place himself in the year 1000 because of its great symbolic power. A new millennium carried with it a sense of destiny and divine approval. By manipulating the calendar, Otto could claim to be the ruler chosen by God to lead Christendom into a new age. The Pope, Sylvester II, would have benefited as well, strengthening the authority of the Church during a time of political turbulence. And Constantine VII, ruling in Byzantium, may have also gained by reshaping the imperial timeline. To align with his vision of history, Illig suggested that these rulers, with the help of clerics and scholars, rewrote documents, adjusted chronicles, and filled in the missing centuries with invented figures and events. Later generations then accepted these records as genuine, never realizing that they were built on falsehood. When Illig published his ideas in 1991, they created a storm of debate. Many historians dismissed the hypothesis as absurd. They argued that too much evidence from outside Europe contradicted it. The Arab world and the Chinese dynasties had their own well-documented histories covering those centuries, and these could not simply be ignored. They pointed out that astronomy, with its precise record of eclipses and celestial events, confirmed the passage of time across the disputed years. To them, Illig's theory was not only wrong but dangerous, because it encouraged distrust of historical research. Yet despite these criticisms, the phantom time hypothesis refused to die. Part of its appeal lay in its boldness. People are drawn to the possibility that history might be a grand illusion. The thought that centuries could be invented and that we might be living in a different year than we believe is both terrifying and thrilling. It forces us to question the reliability of the past and the trust we place in authority. Illig was not alone in developing this idea. Other thinkers, such as Anatoly Fomenko in Russia, also proposed radical revisions of history. Fomenko's new chronology argued that most of ancient history had been fabricated, and that events traditionally separated by centuries were actually duplicates of each other. While Illig's theory focused on 3 centuries in Europe, Fomenko went even further, suggesting that almost everything before the year 1000 was unreliable. Both theories shared the same suspicion that history had been deliberately manipulated. Illig's version, however, had a more specific target and a clearer motive. By accusing medieval rulers of creating 300 years, he tied the theory to concrete historical figures and a recognizable moment in time. This made the hypothesis easier for the public to grasp, and it gave people a story to hold on to. The story of emperors and popes conspiring to rewrite the very fabric of time has the shape of a legend, but it is told with the language of scholarship, That combination made it powerful. As the debate spread, the phantom time hypothesis began to appear in books, documentaries, and articles. It was often criticized, but it was rarely ignored. Even those who rejected it outright admitted that it raised interesting questions about how we build our picture of the past. Historians rely on fragile sources, on texts that can be copied or forged, on artifacts that can be lost or misinterpreted. If even a small part of the timeline could be manipulated, what else might we be missing? By the late 1990s, Illig's hypothesis had become famous in circles of alternative history. It was dismissed by most academics, but it gained a loyal following among those who enjoyed questioning authority and exploring the edges of accepted knowledge. For some, it became less about whether the theory was literally true and more about the idea that history itself is never certain. The gaps and silences of the past invite speculation, and Illig gave that speculation a dramatic shape. The phantom time hypothesis remains controversial to this day. Mainstream historians point to overwhelming evidence against it, but its appeal lies not in its proof but in its possibility. It speaks to a deep human fascination with hidden truths and lost time. We are drawn to mysteries that suggest the world is stranger than it appears. The thought that 300 years might never have existed, that an emperor and a pope could alter time itself, is a story that captures the imagination in ways that no ordinary historical debate can dot. This is how the hypothesis was born. It came not from the Middle Ages themselves, but from a modern historian who dared to challenge the timeline. Whether or not he was correct, Heribert Illig succeeded in reminding us that history is not a fixed and perfect record. It is a fragile structure built on documents, stones, and stories, all of which can be altered or lost. When we rely on these fragments, we place our trust in human memory, and memory is never free from doubt. The origins of the phantom time hypothesis lie in suspicion, in the courage to ask what most people consider impossible. From there, theory spread into a larger conversation, forcing us to think about what we know, how we know it, and whether the past we accept is truly the past that happened. If the phantom time hypothesis were nothing more than a wild idea, it would have been forgotten quickly. What has kept it alive is the presence of evidence that seems to fit its claims. While many of these details can be explained in other ways, taken together they form a picture that feels unsettling. To understand why some people believe nearly 3 centuries were invented, we need to look closely at the strange evidence that surrounds the so-called Dark Ages. The first and most important piece is the absence of physical remains. Historians usually rely on artifacts, inscriptions, and buildings to trace the lives of past generations. From the time of the Roman Empire, we have countless ruins, from aqueducts and amphitheaters to inscriptions carved into stone. From the High Middle Ages, we have cathedrals, castles, manuscripts, and an explosion of art and architecture. Yet, when we examine the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, the landscape feels almost empty. There are a few structures and a handful of documents, but far fewer than one would expect for 300 years of history across an entire continent. This silence is particularly noticeable in architecture. Between the fall of Rome and the rise of Romanesque and Gothic building styles, there is little to point to. Most of the surviving churches from this period were either rebuilt in later centuries or so heavily modified that the original structures are nearly impossible to identify. Large stone monuments, which should have been markers of the era, are strangely absent. The sudden appearance of massive cathedral construction in the 10th and 11th centuries feels abrupt, as though centuries of gradual development had never occurred. Coins and inscriptions also tell a troubling story. Numismatists, experts in ancient currency, note that coinage from the disputed centuries is limited in both number and variety. In earlier Roman times, coins were abundant and spread widely across Europe. In later medieval times, they multiplied as kingdoms expanded trade. But in the period between 614 and 911, the evidence thins out dramatically. For those who believe in phantom time, this scarcity is not a sign of economic hardship, but proof that the years themselves were invented. If people did not exist in those centuries, then naturally they left no coins behind. Documents present another layer of mystery. Many manuscripts from the early Middle Ages appear to be copies of older texts rather than original works. Religious documents in particular were frequently duplicated, sometimes with little to distinguish them from their supposed predecessors. To believers in phantom time, this pattern looks like deliberate fabrication. Instead of authentic writings from a vibrant age, what we see are clerics in later centuries, creating material to fill the gap. One of the strangest cases is the repetition of chronicles. Records describing rulers, battles, and events often mirror earlier accounts, with only names and places altered. It is as if scribes borrowed templates from the past rather than recording new realities. While mainstream historians explain this as the natural result of limited literacy and reliance on traditional forms, to Illig and his supporters it suggests something more deliberate. The construction of entire centuries out of recycled material. Astronomical records deepen the puzzle. History is sometimes checked against the sky because eclipses, comets, and planetary alignments can be calculated with modern science and compared with ancient reports. If a medieval chronicle mentions a solar eclipse, we can test whether that eclipse really occurred on the stated date. In many cases, this method works well, but in the early Middle Ages, some alignments do not perfectly match our expectations. Illig used this uncertainty to argue that the timeline itself might be off. If the records do not match the sky, perhaps the fault lies not with the stars, but with our calendar. The calendar itself remains one of the strongest pieces of evidence for those who believe in phantom time. As Illig argued, the Julian calendar was slightly inaccurate, losing one day every 128 years. By the time Pope Gregory XIII corrected it in 1582, the drift should have been around 13 days. Yet the correction removed only 10. Where did the missing 3 days go? To Illig, the answer was clear. The centuries between 614 and 911 never existed. So the calendar error was smaller than it should have been. Critics suggest other explanations, such as local variations in the calculation of Easter or earlier attempts at correction. But the neat fit with Illig's theory has kept this point alive in debate. Charlemagne, the great emperor of the Franks, is perhaps the most controversial piece of the puzzle. Traditional history describes him as the unifier of Europe. Crowned as emperor in the year 800 by the Pope in Rome, he is said to have reformed education, law, and government, leaving behind a legacy that shaped the continent. Yet Illig argued that Charlemagne never existed. The documents about him were written centuries later. The buildings associated with him, such as the Palatine Chapel in Aachen, could easily have been constructed at a later time and attributed to him retroactively. Even his name, Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, sounds more like a symbolic title than a personal one. If phantom time is true, then Charlemagne is nothing more than a legend created to legitimize later rulers. Another strange aspect lies in the sudden transitions of culture. Before the disputed centuries, the Roman world still lingered in fragments. After them, the medieval world appears in full force with castles, cathedrals, and knights. What is missing is the slow, gradual development that usually connects one era to another. Civilizations tend not to leap forward overnight. They evolve step by step. The fact that Europe seems to jump from late antiquity to the high Middle Ages with little in between has long been a puzzle. One that phantom time attempts to solve by suggesting that the missing centuries were never there. The Byzantine Empire adds to the mystery. Records from Constantinople do mention events during the disputed period, but Illig claimed that many of these sources were compiled or edited later. The Emperor Constantine VII, who reigned in the 10th century, was known for rewriting and organizing histories. If phantom time was created, he may have been one of its architects. His role as a scholar and compiler makes him a suspicious figure in the eyes of those who question the timeline. Supporters of the hypothesis also point to medieval art. In paintings and manuscripts, styles shift in ways that sometimes feel abrupt, as though hundreds of years of artistic evolution are compressed into a shorter span. The Carolingian Renaissance, traditionally credited to Charlemagne's court, appears to borrow heavily from earlier Roman and Christian traditions, with less originality than one might expect from a true cultural revival. To Illig, this was evidence not of a renaissance but of later artists reaching backward to invent a golden age that never existed. Taken together, these pieces of evidence create a pattern: scarce coins, missing buildings, repetitive documents, calendar inconsistencies, and legendary rulers all suggest that something unusual is happening in the timeline. For believers, the simplest explanation is that the disputed centuries never took place. If nothing happened in that time, the lack of evidence makes perfect sense. If rulers invented those years, the strange documents and sudden cultural transitions fall into place. The story of phantom time is not built on one piece of evidence alone. It is the accumulation of many small puzzles that, when placed side by side, form a troubling picture. To some, each of these puzzles has a reasonable explanation. To others, the sheer number of them suggests that the entire framework of history may be flawed. One of the key puzzles is the scarcity of written records. Literacy had declined in the centuries following Rome, but even so, we should expect to see more than what survives. Whole kingdoms are known only through a handful of scattered documents. Some rulers who supposedly controlled vast lands are mentioned only briefly, with little more than a name. The chroniclers of later centuries often wrote about these rulers, as if they were important, yet left us no contemporary evidence of their reigns. If 300 years never existed, this silence is exactly what we would expect. Another puzzle comes from archaeology. Excavations across Europe often reveal layers of settlement, where one generation builds on top of another. Roman layers are found beneath medieval ones, but the layers that should represent the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries are strangely thin. Archaeologists have noted this absence in many regions. Instead of 3 centuries of gradual change, we often see a sharp transition, as though history jumped forward without the slow build-up of time. To most scholars, this reflects hardship, war, and population decline. To supporters of phantom time, it is evidence that those centuries were never there in the first place. Astronomy continues to play a role in the debate. Eclipses are among the most reliable markers of time. If a medieval document describes a solar eclipse, we can use modern calculations to determine whether such an eclipse actually happened on that date. When the matches are precise, they confirm our timeline. But in the early medieval period, some eclipse records do not fit perfectly. Critics argue that this is due to errors in medieval observation or later copying mistakes. Supporters of phantom time see it differently. To them, these mismatches are signs that the chronology itself has been stretched or altered. Even the way history was remembered raises questions. Legends and sagas from Northern Europe often compress time, blending figures who should be centuries apart into stories that treat them as near contemporaries. Oral traditions can blur details, but when this blurring consistently overlaps with the disputed centuries, it fuels suspicion. Perhaps these legends remember more than we think. Perhaps they carry traces of a timeline shorter than the one we now accept. Another strange point concerns the development of technology. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Europe displayed innovations in agriculture, architecture, and warfare. Yet, if we look back to the 7th century, many of these technologies are absent. The leap forward appears rapid, almost too rapid, for a society supposedly weighed down by centuries of stagnation. Normally, technological change is gradual, building from one improvement to the next. The missing steps are a mystery. If phantom time is true, then what looks like a sudden leap is simply the natural progress of a society with fewer centuries in its past. The Holy Roman Empire itself is a central part of the puzzle. According to traditional history, the empire began with Charlemagne and his descendants, the Carolingians, but Illig argued that the Carolingian dynasty was invented. The first true rulers, in his view, were the Attinians, beginning with Otto, the first in the mid-10th century. By creating Charlemagne and his empire, later rulers could claim continuity with an imagined golden age, making their authority seem ancient and legitimate. Without phantom time, the Attunians would have been newcomers. With phantom time, they could present themselves as heirs to centuries of tradition. Critics of the hypothesis often point to records from outside Europe as proof that the missing centuries did exist. The Islamic caliphates left behind detailed chronicles, coins, and architecture from the 7th through 9th centuries. Chinese dynasties also maintained careful records of eclipses and court events. These sources appear to fill the gap. Yet supporters of phantom time argue that our synchronization of these histories with European chronology is not perfect. If the European calendar was stretched, then foreign records may have been aligned incorrectly when later historians attempted to connect them. The possibility of misalignment leaves just enough doubt to keep the theory alive. Another piece of evidence is the psychology of power. History has often been written and rewritten to serve rulers. Kings and emperors throughout the ages have altered genealogies, forged documents, and adjusted chronologies to strengthen their claims. If this happened on a small scale, why not on a larger one? Why should we assume that medieval rulers, who controlled both secular and religious power, were incapable of fabricating time itself if it served their goals? The precedent of manipulation makes the idea at least conceivable, even if difficult to prove. The religious aspect is also important. The symbolic weight of the year 1000 cannot be overstated. In a deeply Christian world, numbers carried spiritual meaning. To stand as emperor or pope at the dawn of a new millennium was to be touched by destiny. Illig believed that Otto III and Pope Sylvester II saw this clearly and seized the chance to place themselves at the heart of sacred history. If they had to bend the calendar to achieve this, then so be it. The manipulation of time became a tool of divine politics. Skeptics insist that these arguments misunderstand how history works. They point out that the scarcity of records is expected in a period of upheaval, that architectural gaps reflect poverty rather than absence, and that copying texts was a common practice in all ages. They argue that eclipses do match when studied carefully, and that foreign records confirm the disputed centuries beyond any reasonable doubt. But even these rebuttals cannot erase the strangeness entirely. The Dark Ages remain dark for a reason, and the shadows invite questions. What makes the evidence of phantom time so powerful is not that it proves the theory beyond doubt, but that it casts doubt on the solidity of history itself. Each missing coin, each silent century of archaeology, each suspiciously copied manuscript becomes a reminder that the past is not as certain as we often believe. History is built from fragments, and fragments can be interpreted in more than one way. The strange evidence forms the backbone of the phantom time hypothesis. It is a collection of silences, gaps, and inconsistencies that resist easy explanation. Whether these gaps are the result of hardship, accident, or deliberate invention remains the great question. For those who believe, the answer is clear. 300 years never existed. For those who doubt, the evidence remains puzzling but not conclusive. Either way, it forces us to look at the past with new eyes and to wonder how much of what we accept as history is truly beyond question. The phantom time hypothesis may sound intriguing, but it has faced strong criticism from historians, archaeologists, and scientists since the moment it was proposed. While supporters of the theory highlight the gaps and silences in the historical record, skeptics argue that these mysteries can be explained in more ordinary ways. To understand why the hypothesis has never been widely accepted, we must consider the alternative explanations and counterarguments that challenge it. One of the strongest counterarguments comes from the field of archaeology. Archaeologists across Europe have uncovered evidence of continuous settlement during the centuries in question. Villages, farms, and burial sites that can be dated to the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries have been discovered, and they often show signs of gradual change rather than sudden jumps. For example, pottery styles evolved step by step with small differences that reflect local traditions. If 300 years were invented, such gradual transitions would be difficult to explain. Instead of a sudden break, the material record suggests continuity, even if it is sparse compared to other eras. Written records, though limited, also exist from the disputed centuries. Monasteries in particular preserved documents, often in the form of charters, legal agreements, and religious texts. While many of these are copies, some appear to be genuine originals. The survival of any documents at all from a time of war, disease, and instability is remarkable. Historians point out that the early medieval period was not a time of cultural flourishing, so it is natural that fewer records survive. The scarcity is therefore a reflection of hardship rather than fabrication. Astronomical evidence also challenges the hypothesis. While Illig emphasized mismatches between medieval eclipse records and modern calculations, most astronomers disagree with his conclusions. Careful analysis shows that medieval descriptions often lack precision. Chroniclers sometimes wrote of eclipses as symbolic events rather than precise astronomical records. They exaggerated their darkness or misstated them by a few years. When corrected for these tendencies, many of the eclipses align well with known astronomical events, This weakens the argument that the timeline itself is flawed. Foreign records are perhaps the most significant challenge. The Islamic caliphates, which expanded rapidly during the 7th and 8th centuries, produced detailed histories, architecture, and coins that match the disputed timeline. To erase 300 years of European history would also require erasing centuries of Islamic history, which seems highly unlikely. Similarly, Chinese dynasties maintained meticulous astronomical records, including eclipses and comets, which correspond with the traditional dating. To dismiss these as misaligned requires assuming a vast global conspiracy of error, one that seems less plausible than the simpler explanation that the centuries did, in fact, occur. Coins also undermine the hypothesis when studied in detail. While Illig argued that there were too few coins from the disputed centuries, numismatists note that coin production fluctuated with economic conditions. During times of instability, fewer coins were minted, and many were melted down and reused. The coins that do survive from the early medieval period show gradual changes in design and metal content that are consistent with real historical development. If 3 centuries were invented, we would expect to see sudden jumps rather than slow transitions. Architecture, too, tells a more complex story than Illig suggested. While it is true that large stone monuments are scarce in the early Middle Ages, this does not mean they did not exist. Many wooden structures from the period have not survived, and others were later rebuilt or absorbed into newer buildings. Archaeological excavations sometimes reveal foundations of earlier churches beneath later cathedrals, showing that construction did take place, even if the original forms are no longer visible. The absence of monumental architecture reflects economic decline and shifting political structures rather than an absence of time. The figure of Charlemagne also provides a key counterargument. While Illig claimed that Charlemagne never existed, there is a considerable amount of evidence suggesting otherwise. The Palatine Chapel in Aachen, built in his time, still stands as a major architectural achievement. Numerous documents, from legal codes to royal charters, bear his name and reflect his administration. While some of these documents may have been copied later, their sheer number and diversity make total fabrication unlikely. Furthermore, Charlemagne's influence on later European politics and culture is hard to explain if he were a fictional invention. The Carolingian Renaissance, modest though it may have been, introduced reforms in writing, education, and administration that shaped Europe for centuries. The calendar argument, which lies at the heart of Illig's theory, also has alternative explanations. The difference of 3 days between the expected Julian drift and the Gregorian correction does not necessarily mean that centuries were invented. Historians of science suggest that the calculations of the drift were not as precise as Illig assumed. Local variations in how Easter was calculated, as well as earlier adjustments to the calendar, may account for the missing days. The Church had long been aware of the problem and may have made informal corrections before the Gregorian reform. In this view, the calendar discrepancy is a technical detail rather than proof of phantom time. Psychology also plays a role in understanding why the hypothesis is appealing yet misleading. Human beings are naturally drawn to conspiracy theories because they provide simple explanations for complex problems. The Dark Ages are puzzling, filled with gaps and mysteries, so it is tempting to imagine that they never happened at all. But historians caution that gaps in the record are normal, especially in times of decline. The absence of evidence does not mean the absence of time. To leap from silence to fabrication is to mistake the limits of our knowledge for proof of deception. Another Counterargument concerns the sheer scale of the supposed conspiracy. If 300 years were invented, it would have required coordination between rulers, clerics, and chroniclers across much of Europe and beyond. Every monastery, every court, and every record keeper would have had to participate or at least remain silent. Such a large-scale fabrication would be almost impossible to maintain. While small forgeries and manipulations of history are common, the invention of centuries would be unprecedented in both scale and ambition. Skeptics argue that the burden of proof for such a claim is extraordinarily high, and Illig's evidence does not meet that burden. Despite these counterarguments, the phantom time hypothesis continues to fascinate because it highlights real mysteries. The scarcity of records, the abrupt cultural changes, and the symbolic power of the year 1000 are all genuine puzzles. Even if the hypothesis is wrong, it draws attention to the fragility of our historical knowledge. It reminds us that history is constructed from incomplete fragments and that certainty is often an illusion. For many people, that reminder is both unsettling and compelling. While the main criticisms of phantom time deal with archaeology, written sources, and astronomy, there are also more subtle counterarguments that come from examining how history is written and remembered. These arguments remind us that the flaws in the record may reflect the nature of human memory and transmission rather than a deliberate invention of centuries. One of these subtler points concerns the role of oral tradition. Much of early medieval Europe relied on memory rather than writing to preserve its past. Stories of kings and battles were passed down by word of mouth before being recorded centuries later. In this process, details often became blurred, compressed, or exaggerated. When sagas and chronicles describe events that seem to telescope time, this may simply be the natural result of oral transmission. People tend to remember the highlights of history and condense generations into a few legendary figures. The apparent compression of time in legends, then, does not require centuries of history to be erased. Only the recognition that memory is selective and imprecise. Another subtle counterargument lies in the idea of historical silence itself. Supporters of phantom time see silence as evidence of absence. Skeptics argue that silence is a normal feature of history, especially in periods of poverty, disease, and war. Not every society leaves abundant records, and many records have been lost. Fires in monasteries, invasions that destroyed archives, and simple neglect over centuries have erased vast amounts of evidence. The fact that we lack sources from the early Middle Ages may not be suspicious at all. It may simply reflect the harsh realities of survival during those centuries. The role of the Church also complicates the picture. While some argue that the papacy would have benefited from adding centuries to the calendar, others suggest the opposite. The Church depended on stability and continuity, not disruption. Altering the calendar so drastically would have risked exposing the fraud, undermining its authority. Moreover, Church records show signs of gradual evolution rather than sudden invention. Liturgical practices, theological debates, and ecclesiastical structures all developed over time. These developments are difficult to explain if 3 centuries were fabricated wholesale. Language provides another counterpoint. Linguists study the evolution of languages by examining changes in grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary. The development of Old English into Middle English, or of Latin into the Romance languages, shows steady and measurable progress. These linguistic shifts cannot easily be compressed into a shorter period without creating inconsistencies. If 3 centuries were missing, languages would have had to evolve much faster than is normally possible. The evidence of language, then, supports the existence of the disputed centuries. Science also adds perspective. Techniques such as dendrochronology, which uses tree rings to date wood, and radiocarbon dating provide independent checks on the historical timeline. These methods confirm that artifacts and structures attributed to the early medieval period do indeed date from that era. A wooden beam from a church foundation, for example, can be dated by counting tree rings that match known climatic patterns. Radiocarbon analysis can confirm the approximate age of bones or tools. These scientific techniques create an external timeline that does not rely on written records, and they consistently support the existence of the 7th through 9th centuries. Furthermore, the supposed motives of the conspirators raise questions. If Otto III and Pope Sylvester II had truly invented 3 centuries of history, the risk of discovery would have been immense. The credibility of the empire and the papacy would have been destroyed if the fraud were revealed. Yet they pursued policies and reforms that suggest genuine concern for governance and religion, not the maintenance of an impossible deception. Ambition may explain many things, but it cannot easily explain a conspiracy of this magnitude with no clear evidence of its execution. The global context is another important consideration. While Elig's theory focused on Europe, the world was not isolated. Trade connected Europe to the Islamic world and indirectly to Asia. Goods, ideas, and even diseases moved across continents. If 3 centuries were missing, how could Europe's history be synchronized with that of the Caliphates or Tang China? The existence of cross-cultural contacts during the disputed period, recorded in foreign sources, suggests that Europe was not living in a fabricated bubble of time. Another challenge to the hypothesis comes from the study of climate. Scientists reconstruct past climates using evidence from ice cores, tree rings, and sediment layers. These studies show patterns of droughts, cold spells, and volcanic eruptions that match events described in historical records. If centuries were invented, these environmental timelines would be thrown out of sync. Instead, they align with the traditional chronology. For example, a major volcanic eruption in the 6th century produced years of cold weather and crop failure, an event reflected in both historical accounts and scientific data. The consistency between natural and human records reinforces the accepted timeline. The argument about the symbolic importance of the year 1000 also faces scrutiny. While the millennium did carry religious significance, historians note that the obsession with the year 1000 was not as widespread as later writers imagined. Many people in Europe may not even have known the exact year, since calendars were not standardized across regions. The idea of a society waiting breathlessly for the turning of the millennium is more a modern projection than a medieval reality. If the year 1000 was not universally recognized as a moment of destiny, then the supposed motive for creating phantom time loses much of its force. Finally, there is the question of historical method. The phantom time hypothesis often treats uncertainty as evidence of deception. Historians, by contrast, accept uncertainty as a normal part of their work. They expect gaps in the record, inconsistencies between sources, and errors in transmission. These imperfections do not necessarily indicate fraud. They are simply the texture of the past. To leap from imperfection to fabrication requires a higher standard of proof than the hypothesis provides. In the end, the counterarguments do not erase the mysteries of the early Middle Ages, but they place them in a broader context. Gaps in The record are explained by poverty, war, and oral tradition. Archaeology shows continuity rather than absence. Astronomy, when carefully interpreted, aligns with the accepted chronology. Foreign records and scientific dating methods provide independent confirmation. Language evolves steadily over time, and climate evidence matches the traditional calendar. Each of these points adds weight to the conclusion that phantom time is not necessary to explain the puzzles of the past. The persistence of the theory, despite these counter-arguments, reflects not so much its strength as its allure. People are drawn to the idea that history itself could be an invention. The centuries of our past might be a fiction created by the powerful. The very boldness of the claim makes it irresistible. Yet the more we examine the evidence, the more it seems that the mysteries of the Dark Ages are real, not fabricated. They are the mysteries of survival, memory, and transmission in a time when Europe was struggling to rebuild after the collapse of Rome. Phantom time, in this view, is not an answer but a mirror. It reflects our frustration with the silence of the past, our discomfort with uncertainty, and our desire for clarity. But history rarely offers clarity. Instead, it offers fragments, patterns, and possibilities. The challenge is not to invent centuries to fill the silence, but to learn how to live with the gaps and to recognize that the past is always more complex than the stories we tell about it. If the phantom time hypothesis is so strongly challenged by archaeology, linguistics, astronomy, and global records, why does it continue to capture people's imagination? The persistence of the theory tells us something not only about the early Middle Ages, but also about the way human beings think about history, power, and truth. One reason the theory endures is the natural attraction of mystery. The so-called Dark Ages are already a period with an aura of uncertainty. Unlike the grandeur of Rome or the flourishing of the Renaissance, the centuries between them feel like shadows, sparse records, missing monuments, and unclear transitions give an impression of a world half hidden. Into this shadowy space, a theory like phantom time can easily slip, offering a bold explanation for the silence. Where history feels thin, invention feels possible. The theory also survives because it appeals to suspicion of authority. For centuries, people have distrusted rulers, priests, and governments. If powerful figures could fabricate centuries of history to serve their ambitions, then no record can be trusted. This idea resonates in an age where institutions are frequently questioned and conspiracy theories flourish. To believe in phantom time is to join a community of skeptics who refuse to accept official versions of the past. It is an act of intellectual rebellion, even if the evidence does not support it. Psychology plays an important role as well. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. When faced with gaps or inconsistencies, we instinctively search for explanations. Illig's theory offers a simple, dramatic answer to the puzzles of the early Middle Ages. Instead of attributing silence to decay, destruction, or neglect, it attributes it to deliberate invention. This makes the story more coherent, easier to grasp, and more memorable. Simplicity often triumphs over complexity in the human mind, especially when the simple answer has the shock value of suggesting that 3 centuries of history never existed. The narrative structure of the theory is also compelling. Like a detective story, it begins with clues, gaps in the record, strange anomalies in the calendar, inconsistencies in the chronicles. It then builds suspense, asking the audience to question everything they thought they knew about history. Finally, it delivers a shocking revelation. Whole centuries are fake. This pattern mirrors the arc of a mystery novel or thriller, where hidden truths are revealed in dramatic fashion. People are not just convinced by evidence, they are captivated by stories. And the phantom time hypothesis tells a story that is hard to forget. Another reason for its endurance lies in the sheer boldness of the claim. Most historical debates concern small adjustments, whether a battle happened in one year or the next, whether a ruler's reign began in the spring or autumn, whether a certain document is authentic or a forgery. Against this backdrop, the phantom time hypothesis is extraordinary. It does not quibble over details, but challenges the entire structure of the timeline. The audacity of this claim sets it apart from ordinary disputes and ensures that it will be remembered even if it is not believed. Modern media has also played a crucial role in keeping the theory alive. Books, documentaries, podcasts, and online videos thrive on controversial topics that grab attention. The phantom time hypothesis is perfect for this environment. It is provocative, easy to summarize, and open-ended enough to invite endless speculation. Every retelling spreads the idea. Further, often without the critical context provided by historians. In the world of clickbait headlines and viral content, the suggestion that 300 years of history never happened is irresistible. The theory also resonates with a deeper cultural anxiety, the fragility of knowledge. Most people assume that history is stable, a fixed record of what happened. But when they learn that much of history rests on fragile manuscripts, scattered artifacts, and interpretations that can change, they feel a sense of unease. The phantom time hypothesis exploits this unease, suggesting that if our records are so fragile, perhaps they could be entirely fabricated. In this way, the theory becomes a metaphor for our vulnerability, a reminder that certainty is always less secure than we imagine. There is also a fascination with the possibility of living in a lie. Stories of hidden truths and great deceptions are staples of literature and film. From tales of forged identities to secret histories, people are drawn to the idea that reality is not what it seems. The phantom time hypothesis taps into this fascination, offering the ultimate historical deception. To believe it, or even to entertain it, is to step into a world where time itself is uncertain. At the same time, the theory reflects a broader skepticism toward progress. Traditional history presents time as a march from Rome to the Middle Ages to the Renaissance and beyond. But phantom time disrupts this narrative. It suggests that history is not linear but manipulated, not natural but artificial. This resonates with those who question the stories of progress told by institutions. In an age where people are increasingly aware of propaganda, misinformation, and narrative control, the idea that entire centuries might have been invented feels like an extension of real concerns. Finally, the endurance of the phantom time hypothesis can be explained by its open-endedness. Unlike some conspiracy theories, it does not require absolute belief to have an effect. People can explore it as a thought experiment, a mental game, without fully committing. They can entertain the possibility, debate it, and then move on, still changed by the encounter. This flexibility makes it less rigid and more adaptable than other controversial claims. Even skeptics may enjoy discussing it, if only as a way of questioning how we know what we know. In this sense, the phantom time hypothesis functions not just as a historical claim, but as a cultural story. It is less about proving that centuries were invented and more about exploring the fragility of our relationship with the past. It thrives not because it is correct, but because it embodies doubts, desires, and fascinations that are deeply human. Another reason the phantom time hypothesis endures is the way it fits into the long tradition of alternative chronologies. Throughout history, there have always been thinkers who questioned the standard timeline. Some believed that ancient civilizations were far older than historians admitted. Others claimed that recorded history was only a few thousand years old. Illig's theory stands in this lineage of alternative thinking, offering a middle ground between exaggeration and reduction. By placing him within this tradition, the idea gains legitimacy in the eyes of those who see mainstream history as too rigid or too dismissive of unconventional voices. Education also plays a part. For many people, history is taught as a list of dates and rulers rather than as a living inquiry into evidence and interpretation. This leaves students with little sense of how history is constructed or how fragile its foundations can be. When they encounter a theory like phantom time, they are unprepared to evaluate it critically. The gaps in their education become fertile ground for doubt. A claim that might seem absurd to a trained historian can seem plausible to someone who never learned how evidence is weighed and timelines are built. The persistence of the theory is also aided by the emotional power of the idea. To imagine that one is living in the year 700 instead of the year 1000 is to feel the ground shift under one's feet. It destabilizes the sense of continuity that underpins identity and culture. This destabilization can be thrilling, even liberating. If time itself can be rewritten, then everything becomes open to question. For those dissatisfied with the present, the idea that history is malleable suggests that reality itself is less fixed than it appears. The phantom time hypothesis also benefits from what might be called the allure of the forbidden. Established historians dismiss the theory as unfounded, which only makes it more attractive to those who distrust authority. To embrace phantom time is to position oneself as an outsider, privy to a secret that the mainstream refuses to acknowledge. This sense of being in on a hidden truth is psychologically powerful. It transforms doubt into identity, turning skepticism into a badge of distinction. Another factor is the adaptability of the theory. While Illig's original formulation focused on specific centuries and figures, later versions have been more flexible, incorporating new anomalies and adjusting claims. This plasticity allows the theory to survive criticism. When one argument is debunked, another can be introduced. When a piece of evidence is shown to fit the traditional timeline, attention shifts to a different anomaly. In this way, phantom time evolves rather than collapses, always shifting just enough to remain intriguing. The endurance of the hypothesis is also linked to the limitations of human imagination. For many, it is difficult to grasp the scale of centuries, the slow accumulation of cultural change, or the uneven survival of records. Phantom time provides a shortcut, an explanation that condenses this complexity into a single, dramatic act of invention. By reducing the bewildering variety of early medieval evidence to a narrative of forgery, it makes the past feel more manageable. Paradoxically, by denying history, it makes history easier to comprehend. There is also the matter of playfulness. Some who engage with the theory do so not out of conviction but out of curiosity. They enjoy testing the boundaries of what is possible, treating the hypothesis as a puzzle rather than a creed. In this sense, phantom time becomes a kind of intellectual game, a way to stretch the imagination. Whether or not one believes it, the act of considering it can be stimulating. This playful dimension helps the theory spread beyond those who take it seriously ensuring its continued presence in cultural conversation in the digital age. The theory also gains new life through repetition and remixing. Online platforms allow snippets of information to circulate endlessly, often detached from context. A provocative claim, once posted, can be shared thousands of times, stripped of nuance, and reinterpreted in countless ways. The phantom time hypothesis thrives in this environment, where attention often matters more than accuracy. Each repose, each discussion thread, each video extends its reach, keeping it alive in the collective imagination. The endurance of the idea is also supported by a kind of narrative inertia. Once a story is told and retold, it develops a life of its own. Even if debunked, it remains part of the cultural landscape, cited in debates, referenced in fiction, and revisited by curious minds. In this way, phantom time has achieved a kind of immortality. It no longer depends on evidence or persuasion. It exists because it has been told often enough to secure a place in the marketplace of ideas. Ultimately, the persistence of the phantom time hypothesis reveals as much about the present as about the past. It shows that people are hungry for stories that challenge certainty, that they are drawn to the possibility of hidden truths, and that they find comfort in narratives that make sense of confusion, even if those narratives are false. It also shows that history is not only about facts and dates, but about meaning and identity. By questioning the timeline, the theory forces people to reflect on why the past matters and how much trust they place in those who record it. In this light, the phantom time hypothesis may be less important as a factual claim than as a cultural phenomenon. It embodies the tension between authority and skepticism, between complexity and simplicity, between certainty and doubt. That tension ensures that even if the theory is rejected by historians, it will continue to resonate with audiences. It is a reminder that history is not just about what happened, but about what people believe might have happened, and about the stories that arise when the shadows of the past refuse to yield their secrets. The endurance of the phantom time hypothesis and the debates it sparks reveals something important about the way we understand history itself. At first glance, the idea seems like a fringe curiosity, a strange theory that sits outside the serious work of scholars. But when we look closer, we realize that it touches on deep questions about the nature of evidence, the fragility of memory, and the trust we place in the past. One of the clearest lessons is that history is never complete. Even in well-documented eras, there are gaps, silences, and uncertainties. Manuscripts decay, artifacts are lost, monuments crumble. In the case of the early Middle Ages, these gaps are especially large. Wars, migrations, and the decline of centralized authority left fewer records than in other times. This absence creates space for speculation, reminding us that our picture of the past is always partial. The phantom time hypothesis exaggerates this absence into a grand conspiracy, but the truth it reflects is real. History is built on fragments. Another lesson is that history depends on trust. Few of us will ever hold a medieval manuscript in our hands, or examine pottery shards from an excavation, or calculate astronomical cycles. We rely on experts to do this work and to communicate their findings. When that trust weakens, alternative theories rush to fill the vacuum. The endurance of phantom time reflects both a fascination with mystery and a crisis of confidence in authority. It shows that when people feel disconnected from the process of historical discovery, they become more open to dramatic alternatives. The The theory also highlights the way stories shape our view of the past. People rarely remember lists of dates or catalogues of rulers. What they remember are narratives. Rome falling, Europe descending into darkness, the Renaissance bursting with light. The phantom time hypothesis offers a story just as vivid. Instead of a slow, uncertain drift through obscure centuries, it tells of a bold deception that changed everything. Whether or not the story is true, its power lies in the clarity and drama it provides. This teaches us that history is not only about evidence, but about the way evidence is woven into tales that capture imagination. The debates around phantom time also reveal the importance of method. Historians do not simply collect facts. They compare, cross-check, and test them against independent lines of evidence. Charters are matched with coins, coins with layers of soil, soil with patterns of climate. When one kind of record is uncertain, another can confirm or challenge it. The very process of dismantling Illig's theory demonstrates how history works, not as blind faith in documents, but as a careful weaving together of many strands. The survival of the theory reminds us that without understanding this method, people may mistake uncertainty in one area for uncertainty in all. Another insight is that history is global. The phantom time hypothesis imagines a conspiracy confined to Europe, but history cannot be confined to one region. Chinese astronomers recorded eclipses, Arab scholars wrote chronicles, and civilizations across the world left traces of their own. These records line up with the disputed centuries in Europe, making the idea of fabrication untenable. In this sense, the theory teaches us about interconnectedness. No culture exists in isolation. To alter one timeline would be to disrupt many others. The past is a web, and tampering with one thread would tug at the entire fabric. There is also a lesson about humility. The boldness of Illig's claim reminds us that certainty in history is rare. It is tempting to believe that the timeline we inherit is absolute, carved in stone. But the truth is that historians constantly refine it, correcting errors, questioning assumptions, and adjusting interpretations. The phantom time hypothesis, though extreme, is a reminder that our understanding of the past is always provisional. It is not a weakness to admit this. It is the strength of a discipline that keeps asking questions at the same time. The theory warns us about the dangers of oversimplification. It is easy to take the absence of evidence as evidence of absence, or to interpret silence as deliberate suppression. But the past is messy. Records vanish for countless reasons: fire, flood, neglect, or chance. To claim that silence means conspiracy is to ignore the complexity of how history is preserved or lost. The endurance of phantom time shows how seductive such simplifications can be, and how careful we must be to resist them. Finally, the theory reveals the deep connection between history and identity. To suggest that centuries never happened is not only to question the record, it is to shake the foundations of culture. Nations trace their origins through those centuries. Languages evolved in that time. Traditions, laws, and beliefs were shaped in those years. To erase them is to erase part of who people are. This explains why the theory provokes such strong reactions, both fascination and outrage. It touches not just on facts, but on meaning, not just on documents, but on belonging. In all these ways, the phantom time hypothesis serves as a mirror. It may not tell us much about the actual early Middle Ages, but it tells us a great deal about how humans think about the past. It shows our hunger for stories, our need for trust, our attraction to bold claims, and our struggles with uncertainty. In the end, this may be its most lasting contribution, not as an explanation of history, but as a challenge to reflect on how history is made, remembered, and believed. The phantom time hypothesis also underscores the way history is shaped by perspective. When Illig looked at the gaps in the record, he saw a void that could only be explained by invention. When other historians looked at the same gaps, they saw the ordinary losses of time. Both were staring at the same evidence, yet their interpretations diverged radically. This teaches us that history is not simply the past itself, but the dialogue between evidence and interpretation. Each generation brings its own questions, concerns, and blind spots to the task. What one era calls a mystery, another may see as mundane. In this sense, the endurance of phantom time reminds us that history is always a conversation, never a finished script. The theory also highlights the relationship between history and power. Illig imagined emperors and popes manipulating time to strengthen their authority. While historians reject this specific claim, the broader point that history can be shaped by those in power remains valid. Chronicles are often written at the command of rulers. Victories are celebrated while defeats are minimized. Records can be altered to legitimize authority. This does not mean that centuries were invented, but it does remind us that we must always ask who produced a source and why. The phantom time hypothesis may overstate the case, but it draws attention to a truth. History is not neutral. Another insight is the fragility of continuity. The idea that 3 centuries could disappear strikes us as absurd, yet it points to a real vulnerability. If records had been even sparser, if connections between cultures had been weaker, if natural disasters had destroyed more evidence, large stretches of the past could indeed be lost to us. The fact that we can reconstruct those centuries at all is a testament to the resilience of human memory and the painstaking work of preservation. The theory, by imagining a collapse of continuity, makes us appreciate the delicate chain that links us to those who lived long ago. There is also a lesson about imagination. History is often thought of as a matter of dates and documents, but it also requires creativity. To piece together fragments, historians must imagine contexts, fill in gaps, and construct plausible narratives. Illig's theory shows what happens when imagination is untethered from evidence. It becomes speculation that veers into fantasy. Yet the very existence of the theory shows how imagination can energize the study of history, even when it misleads. It reminds us that history is not only about what we know, but about what we can envision, and that the line between insight and illusion is thin. The persistence of phantom time also teaches us something about the public appetite for mystery. Many people find traditional accounts of the past dry or inaccessible. A theory that suggests hidden centuries and vast conspiracies captures attention in a way that charters and pottery seldom do. This reveals the challenge historians face: to present the past in ways that are both accurate and compelling. If they fail, alternative stories will fill the gap. The endurance of phantom time is thus a call for historians not only to uncover the past, but to share it in ways that resonate with broader audiences. Another lesson lies in the universality of doubt. To question the timeline is, at its heart, to ask how we know what we know. This question reaches far beyond history. It touches on science, politics, and daily life. How do we trust evidence? Who do we believe? And how do we balance skepticism with faith in expertise? The phantom time hypothesis is one expression of this larger struggle. It shows how uncertainty can spill into speculation, and how speculation can harden into belief. It is a reminder that critical thinking is not just a scholarly skill but a civic necessity. The theory also offers a meditation on time itself. We tend to think of years and centuries as solid markers, fixed and objective, yet they are human constructs, ways of measuring the flow of experience. Calendars are cultural artifacts shaped by astronomy, religion, and politics. The idea that years could be added or erased may be false, but it gestures toward a deeper truth. Time is not only natural but cultural. How we measure it affects how we live it. The phantom time hypothesis dramatizes this fact by suggesting that the calendar itself is a battleground of meaning. Finally, the theory underscores the enduring mystery of the past. Even when historians dismantle Illig's claims, the sense of wonder remains. There will always be shadows in history, gaps that cannot be filled, silences that cannot be broken. The phantom time hypothesis may not solve these mysteries, but it dramatizes them, reminding us that the past is never fully within our grasp. This is not a failure, but a gift. It means that history will always be a realm of discovery, a landscape where curiosity can roam. In this way, the phantom time hypothesis, though rejected as history, succeeds as provocation. It pushes us to think harder about what history is, how it is made, and why it matters. It reminds us that evidence must be weighed, that trust must be earned, that stories must be told with care, and that the past is both fragile and resilient. By questioning the timeline, it challenges us to see history not as a finished book, but as an ongoing dialogue, written by many hands, shaped by many voices, and always open to revision. As we come to the end of this long exploration, it is worth pausing to reflect on what the journey has revealed. At the center of our story was a bold claim that nearly 3 centuries of the early Middle Ages never happened, that kings and popes invented years and filled them with phantom rulers and phantom wars. On its face, the idea strains belief, and yet, as we have seen, it captured attention, spread across books and discussions, and refused to fade into obscurity. To understand why, we had to look not only at the details of the claim, but at the larger questions it raises about history itself. We saw that the phantom time hypothesis begins with gaps in the record. The early Middle Ages are less documented than the eras before and after. There are fewer surviving manuscripts, fewer grand buildings, fewer accounts of events. Illig looked at this silence and declared it intentional. He believed that rulers had manufactured centuries to serve their own power. Historians, however, see a different picture. They explain the gaps through the turbulence of the time, the fall of empires, the shifting of peoples, and the fragility of records. Where Illig saw conspiracy, they see circumstance. This contrast reveals how the same absence can lead to radically different interpretations, depending on the assumptions we bring. We also explored the evidence Illig presented, architectural, styles that seemed to leap too quickly, calendars that seemed misaligned, artifacts that appeared sparse. One by one, historians tested these claims. They showed that styles evolve unevenly, that calendars are complex but consistent, and that artifacts do survive if one looks carefully and broadly. They found cross-checks in coins, in layers of soil, in the writings of distant civilizations. Each strand of evidence reinforced the timeline rather than undermined it. The theory faltered under scrutiny, but the process of scrutiny itself became illuminating. It showed how history is constructed, not from any single source, but from the weaving together of many. The persistence of the theory also led us to ask why people remain drawn to it even when experts dismiss it. Here we discovered insights into human psychology. The theory offers drama, a clear and gripping story of deception and revelation. It appeals to skepticism about authority, to the thrill of imagining hidden truths. It resonates with broader cultural doubts about expertise and institutions. Even if the evidence against it is strong, the emotional power of the story keeps it alive. In this sense, the phantom time hypothesis is less about what happened in the Middle Ages than about what happens in our minds when we confront uncertainty. We then considered what this tells us about history more broadly. The theory highlights the fragility of memory, the dependence on trust, the lure of narrative, and the constant interplay between evidence and interpretation. It warns against oversimplification while reminding us of the complexities of preservation. It points to the role of power in shaping records, the interconnectedness of global histories, and the inevitability of gaps. Above all, it underscores the fact that history is not fixed. It is a discipline of questioning, of refining, of revising. Certainty is rare, but inquiry is constant, seen in this light. The phantom time hypothesis, though false, is not meaningless. It serves as a mirror, reflecting our hopes and doubts, our curiosity and our suspicion. It challenges us to think critically, to ask how we know what we know, and to appreciate the delicate work that goes into reconstructing the past. It reminds us that skepticism without method leads to fantasy, but that imagination tempered by evidence leads to understanding. It demonstrates that even the strangest theories can be valuable if they push us to examine our assumptions more deeply. There is also a broader lesson here about the role of history in society. History is not just a record of events. It is a foundation for identity. It tells us who we are, where we come from, and what we might become. To suggest that centuries never happened is to unsettle that foundation. That is why the theory evokes such strong responses, from fascination to outrage. It touches on belonging, on meaning, on the continuity that links generations. The persistence of phantom time shows how much people care about the past, even when they disagree about its details. In the end, the phantom time hypothesis is less a story about deception than about wonder. It is a reminder that the past will always hold mysteries, that no amount of evidence can erase uncertainty completely. There will always be gaps, shadows, and questions that refuse to vanish. That is not a weakness, but a strength. It means that history is alive, that it is not a static archive, but an open field of discovery. To study the past is not to close a book, but to enter a dialogue that stretches across centuries, a dialogue that each of us can join. So what do we carry forward from this journey? Perhaps it is the recognition that history requires both skepticism and trust, both imagination and discipline. It requires us to doubt boldly, but also to test carefully, to question authority, but also to respect expertise, to embrace stories, but also to demand evidence. The phantom time hypothesis shows what happens when doubt runs unchecked, but also what happens when historians respond with patience, rigor, and humility. Together, they remind us that truth is not handed down but built, slowly and painstakingly, from the fragments of what remains. And so the story ends, not with a grand revelation that centuries were stolen, but with a subtler insight. The real lesson of phantom time is not that history was falsified, but that history is precious. It is fragile and resilient, contested and cherished, mysterious and illuminating. It belongs not just to scholars, but to everyone who wonders about the past. To question it is human. To explore it is essential. To preserve it is a responsibility we all share. The phantom time hypothesis may remain on the margins of scholarship, but its echoes continue. Each time it is told, it reminds us that the past is not beyond reach, but always just at the edge of our grasp, inviting us to look closer, to think deeper, and to remember that history, in all its complexity, is a story still being written.